The crimson glow stretched across space like spilled blood against black silk. 300 Draconian warships moved in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the dark metal that had crushed worlds and shattered dreams across 47 star systems. Each vessel was the size of a small city, bristling with weapons that could crack planets and shields that had never been breached. Admiral Vorthak stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Death's Herald, watching Earth grow larger on the main display, his reptilian features twisted into what passed for satisfaction among his kind. The blue-green world looked so peaceful, so defenseless. Small white clouds drifted across its surface like cotton scattered by a child. Distance to target? He growled, his voice echoing through the bridge where dozens of Draconian officers worked at their stations. 12 million kilometers in closing, Admiral, replied Commander Thexus, his tactical officer. The younger Draconian's scales showed, the nervous pattern shifts that betrayed his excitement. This would be their 48th conquest, and like all the others it would be swift and brutal. Vorthak's clawed hands gripped the railing as he surveyed his fleet through the viewport. The sight never failed to inspire him. Destroyer class ships flanked the massive dreadnoughts, while fighter squadrons darted between the larger vessels like deadly insects. Each ship represented centuries of military evolution, forged in the fires of endless conquest. "Sir, our long-range sensors are picking up something unusual," called out the sensor operator, her voice uncertain. "What kind of unusual?" Vorthak demanded. "Nothing, sir. That's what's unusual. No orbital defense platforms, no military satellites, no asteroid mining stations with defensive capabilities. Their space around the planet is practically empty except for some primitive communication satellites and a small space station." Vorthak studied the tactical display. It showed Earth surrounded by nothing. No weapons, no shields, no fleets rushing to intercept them. The humans hadn't even attempted to evacuate their population or move their ships to defensive positions. "Are they surrendering already?" wondered Commander Thexus. "Impossible," Vorthak snarled. "No species has ever surrendered before we've even announced our presence. They must be hiding something." But the deep scans revealed only cities full of humans going about their daily business. Traffic moved through streets, lights twinkled in windows, and everything appeared completely normal. It was as if the approaching armada was invisible to them. "Perhaps they haven't detected us yet," suggested the sensor operator. Vorthak's laugh was like grinding stone. "Their primitive technology couldn't spot a Draconian fleet until we're practically in their atmosphere. But our information networks show they have basic radio telescopes and space monitoring. They should know we're here." Unknown to the Draconians, they had been tracked since the moment they crossed into the outer edges of the solar system. Light years away from their current position, their entry had triggered responses that existed beyond the understanding of conventional physics. In a small cafe in Seoul, surrounded by the gentle hum of conversation and the soft clink of coffee cups, Jinho appeared to be just another 20-something office worker taking his morning break. He wore a simple blue sweater and jeans, his black hair slightly messy from the autumn wind outside. To anyone watching, he was unremarkable. Just another face in the crowd of 8 million people living their lives in the bustling city. But while his hands wrapped around his warm coffee cup, his consciousness stretched across space in ways that would have torn apart Draconian minds. He watched the approaching fleet with the casual interest of someone observing ants in his garden. The warships moved with such confidence, such certainty in their superiority. It was almost endearing, like watching children play war games. "They're almost here," he thought, sending the message across hundreds of kilometers to his sister without moving his lips or touching any device. In Busan, Mira knelt in her small garden behind a modest apartment building. Her neighbors thought she had an extraordinary talent for growing things. They didn't realize that as she worked, she was coaxing reality itself to nurture her plants. Flowers bloomed out of season under her touch. Vegetables grew larger and more perfect than nature normally allowed, and even weeds seemed to arrange themselves in pleasing patterns rather than creating chaos. She smiled as she received her brother's message, her fingers never pausing in their work. A tomato plant responded to her attention by producing fruit that glowed with perfect health, while nearby roses opened petals that seemed to capture and reflect light in impossible ways. The real defense of Earth wasn't built from metal and energy weapons. It wasn't hiding behind asteroid fields or cloaked in stealth technology. Humanity's protection was woven into the fundamental structure of reality itself, maintained by ordinary people living ordinary lives who had long ago transcended the need for conventional warfare. Admiral Vorthak would learn this truth soon enough. The massive gas giant Jupiter hung in space like a swirled marble of orange and brown, its great red spot staring at the Draconian fleet like a watching eye. Admiral Vorthak had passed this system landmark countless times in his conquests of other worlds, but today something felt different. Wrong. Admiral. Commander Thexus called from his station, his voice carrying an edge that made the bridge crew look up from their work. The Bone Crusher has gone dark. Vorthak's head snapped toward the tactical display. The Bone Crusher was a heavy destroyer that had been holding position on the fleet's starboard flank just moments ago. Now there was nothing but empty space, where the 2-kilometer-long warship should have been. Define gone dark. Vorthak growled, his claws clicking against the metal railing. No distress signal, no explosion signature, no debris field. The ship was there, and then it wasn't. Like it never existed at all. The Admiral studied the sensor readings with growing unease. Ships didn't just vanish. In 47 conquests, he had seen vessels destroyed, disabled, captured, even torn apart by gravitational forces near black holes. But a complete disappearance without any trace? That was impossible. Sensor malfunction, he decided. Run, a full diagnostic. But even as the words left his mouth, another icon disappeared from the tactical display. The cruiser, Flesh Render, simply winked out of existence, taking its crew of 300 with it. "Sir, that's 2 ships now," reported the sensor operator, her voice rising with barely controlled panic. "All systems show green. No malfunctions detected." The bridge fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant vibration of the ship's massive engines. Every eye turned to the main display, watching their fellow warships as if staring hard enough could keep them from vanishing. Over the next hour, the disappearances accelerated. The destroyer Painbringer faded away while conducting a routine. Sensor sweep. The assault frigate Terror's Edge vanished mid-transmission while reporting normal status. Each loss was clean, surgical, impossible. 17 vessels unaccounted for, sir, the communications officer reported, his voice tight with fear. No pattern we can identify. They're not targeting specific ship classes or formations. It seems completely random. Vorthak felt something he hadn't experienced in decades of warfare. Helplessness. His mighty fleet was being picked apart by an enemy he couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't even detect. The remaining ships had tightened their formation, weapons powered and shields at maximum. But what good were defenses against something that could make warships cease to exist? "Sir, permission to request reinforcements from the home fleet?" asked Commander Thexus. "No," Vorthak snarled. "We don't retreat from primitives. There has to be an explanation." He was right that there was an explanation, but it was one that would have shattered his understanding of the universe. On Earth, in a small playground in Gwangju, 8-year-old Daeho was having the time of his life. He hopped from square to square in his hopscotch game, but between each jump, his young mind casually solved equations that governed the fundamental forces of space-time. To him, it was just as natural as breathing. 1, 2, 3, he counted, giggling as he folded a small section of reality to make his stone land in the perfect spot. The other children playing nearby didn't notice the subtle shimmer in the air around him, or the way shadows seemed to bend slightly in his direction. What they also didn't see was how his innocent curiosity had reached out across the solar system to examine the strange metal objects approaching their world. To Daeho, the Draconian warships were fascinating puzzles. How did they make fire come out the back to push them forward? Why were they shaped so strangely? What would happen if he just borrowed a few to look at more closely? In the adult world, this would be called teleportation or dimensional manipulation. To Daeho, it was like picking up toys to examine them better. The Draconian crews found themselves suddenly floating in a gentle bubble of altered space-time, completely safe, but utterly confused as their ships were transported to a pocket dimension where curious human children could study them without interference. Meanwhile, in Daegu, 72-year-old Kyungmi was organizing her library with the same casual disregard for physical laws. She had worked as a librarian for 50 years, and in that time had developed what she considered a small talent for making her job easier. As she reached for books on high shelves, time seemed to slow around her, allowing her aged joints to move without pain. When she needed to repair torn pages, she would gently encourage the paper to remember its original form, watching as words and images restored themselves. To organize the massive collection, she simply asked space itself to compress slightly, allowing her to reach any book in the building without walking more than a few steps. The other librarians attributed her efficiency to decades of experience. They had no idea that she was casually manipulating the fundamental forces of reality as easily as arranging flowers. Across Earth, similar scenes played out every day. Humanity had evolved beyond the need for external technology. While other species built machines to explore space, humans had turned inward, developing abilities that made them gardeners of reality itself. They were apex predators not through violence but through their complete mastery over the universe's basic building blocks. The Draconian ships continued to disappear, harvested by curious children who found their primitive propulsion methods fascinating subjects for school science projects, never realizing they were casually dismantling one of the galaxy's most feared battle fleets. Admiral Vorthak stood frozen on the bridge of his flagship, watching the tactical display that now showed gaping holes where his mighty warships once dominated space. Half of his fleet had simply vanished without a trace, leaving the surviving vessels scattered and vulnerable. His crew moved nervously at their stations, jumping at every sensor reading, every minor power fluctuation. "Sir, we're receiving an incoming transmission," announced the communications officer, his voice shaking. "But this is impossible. The signal isn't coming through any of our standard channels." "Put it through," Vorthak commanded, his scaled hands gripping the command chair until his claws left marks in the metal. The main view screen flickered, and then something unprecedented happened. Instead of the usual holographic projection of an incoming signal, a figure simply materialized in the center of the bridge as if she had always been there. The Draconian crew scrambled backward, weapons drawn, but their shots passed harmlessly through empty air. The figure was a human teenage girl, perhaps 16 years old, wearing a simple school uniform of navy blue and white. Her black hair was tied back in a neat ponytail, and she carried a backpack covered with colorful patches. She looked around the bridge with curious eyes, taking in the alien architecture and technology with the casual interest of a tourist visiting a museum. "Hello," she said politely in perfect Draconian, though her lips didn't move in sync with the translated words. Her voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I'm Neon. I'm sorry about your ships. The children were just curious about how you make them move." Vorthak felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. This impossible apparition spoke of his battle fleet like they were toys in a sandbox. "What are you?" he managed to whisper. "Human," she replied with a gentle smile, as if the answer explained everything. "We evolved past physical limitations a while ago. Don't worry. Your crews are perfectly fine. They're being studied as part of a school project." Behind her, visible through what seemed like a window into another world, Vorthak could see an ordinary Earth city. Humans walked along sidewalks, cars moved through traffic, children played in parks. Everything appeared completely normal, mundane even. The sight was more terrifying than any weapon he had ever faced. "A school project?" Commander Thexus stepped forward, his weapon still raised, though it clearly served no purpose. "You're telling me that children destroyed half our fleet for homework?" Neon tilted her head thoughtfully. "Oh, they didn't destroy anything. Destruction is wasteful. They just borrowed your ships to understand the propulsion systems. It's actually quite clever how you use controlled explosions to create thrust. Very creative for your level of development. The casual condescension in her words hit harder than any insult. She spoke to them the way an adult might praise a child's finger painting, encouraging but clearly patronizing. "Where are our crews?" Vorthak demanded, finding his voice again. "Safe and comfortable," Naon assured him. "Actually, they're probably feeling better than they have in years. Young Minsu noticed that many of your people had various health issues, so he fixed those while he was examining them. Your soldiers don't suffer from chronic back pain anymore, and that respiratory condition many of your species develops from breathing recycled ship air has been corrected." She gestured, and suddenly the view screen showed images that made the Draconian bridge crew gasp. Their missing comrades were indeed alive and well, floating in what appeared to be comfortable bubbles of light. But they looked different, healthier, younger somehow. Some were laughing and pointing at things outside their containment fields. Others were sleeping peacefully, and a few seemed to be having animated conversations with beings that remained just outside the camera's view. "The children find your anatomy fascinating," Naon continued conversationally. "They've never seen a species that molts scales before. Soren wanted to know if it itches, and Do-Yun was amazed by how your inner eyelids work. They're very polite, though they ask permission before running their tests." "Tests?" Vorthak's voice cracked. "Nothing invasive," she said quickly, as if reassuring worried parents. "Just basic scans to understand your biology and psychology. They're writing reports about different alien cultures for their social studies class. Your empire was actually quite informative. They learned a lot about how fear-based societies develop and maintain power structures." The girl paused, seeming to listen to something only she could hear. "Oh, their teacher wants me to ask if you'd be willing to answer some questions about your government system. They're particularly curious about how you maintain loyalty across so many conquered worlds." Vorthak stared at this teenager who discussed galactic conquest as casually as discussing the weather. "We can return your ships and crews if you'd like," she continued. "But I should warn you that coming closer to Earth might trigger responses that even our adults can't fully control." "Adults?" Thexus asked weakly. Naon's expression grew slightly worried. "The grown-ups don't usually pay attention to small things like visiting ships, but if they perceive a real threat to Earth..." She shrugged. "Well, let's just say that what the children can do is nothing compared to what happens when humanity's protective instincts activate." Through the impossible window behind her, Vorthak could see more of Earth's surface. In a coffee shop, a man in a business suit was reading the news on his tablet while his coffee cup floated gently beside him without any visible support. On a street corner, an elderly woman was feeding pigeons that seemed to be arranged in perfect, geometric patterns around her feet. A construction worker on a building site was bending steel beams with his bare hands while humming a tune. None of them seemed aware that they were being observed by the commander of a galactic invasion fleet. They were just living their lives, completely oblivious to the fact that their mere existence was rewriting everything Vorthak thought he knew about power in the universe. "So," Naon said brightly, "what would you like to do?" Admiral Vorthak's scaled face twisted with rage as he stared at the teenage girl's image floating on his bridge. The casual way she spoke about his mighty fleet, the condescending tone when discussing his warriors as if they were specimens in a zoo, it was more than his pride could bear. "You think we're afraid of children and parlor tricks?" he roared, spittle flying from his reptilian mouth. "The Draconian Empire has crushed civilizations that spanned galaxies. We are not intimidated by primitive humans playing with forces they don't understand." Naon's expression shifted to one of genuine concern. "Please don't do anything rash. The children were just curious, but if you actually attack..." "Silence!" Vorthak cut her off with a savage gesture. "Commander Thexus, power all weapons. Target their pathetic blue world. We'll show these primitives what real power looks like." "Sir, are you certain?" Thexus hesitated, his clawed hand hovering over the weapons console. "Perhaps we should..." "Do it now, or I'll have you executed for cowardice." The remaining 150 Draconian warships began to hum with deadly energy. Plasma cannons that could melt continents charged to full power. Quantum torpedoes capable of cracking moons loaded into their launch tubes. Planet-killer missiles armed themselves, with nuclear fury that had ended countless worlds. Naon's image flickered, her young face filled with sadness rather than fear. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and then she was gone. The moment the first draconian weapon systems reached full charge, something that had slumbered for millennia stirred deep within Earth's collective human consciousness. It wasn't anger or fear, it was something far more primal and infinitely more dangerous. It was the awakening of protective instincts that had evolved beyond the understanding of normal species. In a small coffee shop in Incheon, 25-year-old Hyunwoo was preparing the morning rush. He'd been a barista for 3 years and took pride in making the perfect cup. Today felt different somehow. His hands were steadier, his movements more precise. As he ground coffee beans, the particles seemed to arrange themselves in perfect spirals without him trying. When he activated the espresso machine, something went wrong. The pressure built beyond normal limits, and instead of stopping the process, Hyunwoo found himself unconsciously compressing the steam and water molecules tighter and tighter, until space itself began to warp around the coffee cup. A tiny black hole no bigger than a pinhead flickered into existence above the espresso. Hyunwoo blinked in surprise, then casually dispersed it with a thought as if he'd simply spilled some milk. "Oops," he muttered, completely unaware that he'd just created and destroyed a gravitational anomaly that should have been impossible. Across the city in Ulsan, construction worker Yoonji was having the strangest day of her career. She'd been building high-rises for 15 years, and today, her tools seemed to have minds of their own. When she reached for her hammer, it floated gently into her hand. Steel beams that normally required cranes to move shifted position with just a touch of her fingers. "That's weird," she said to her coworker Yemin, who was watching a concrete mixer pour its contents upward into the building's framework without any pumps or hoses. "Is it just me, or does gravity feel optional today?" Similar scenes were playing out across the entire planet. In Jeju, marine biologist Kiwoo watched in amazement as fish in the harbor began swimming in perfect mathematical patterns, their movements creating living fractals in the water. Office worker Boyoung in Busan found that her computer could process information faster than should have been possible, displaying calculations that seemed to solve themselves. 8 billion human minds, each one touched by evolutionary forces that had been quietly developing for centuries, suddenly resonated with a single unified purpose: protect Earth. The planet itself began to change. Reality started to bend and fold around the blue world like origami made from the fabric of space-time. Mountains phased in and out of different dimensions. Oceans reflected stars from parallel universes. The sky showed glimpses of alternate realities where different physical laws applied. Admiral Vorthak watched his tactical display with growing horror as his fleet's carefully maintained formation began to scatter. The space around Earth was no longer behaving according to any physics, he understood. "Sir, our navigation systems are going crazy," reported his helmsman. "We're detecting impossible gravitational readings. Space itself seems to be folded." The Draconian warships found themselves trapped in a maze of twisted space-time. When they fired their weapons, the energy beams curved back on themselves, disappearing into dimensional pockets that led nowhere. Plasma bolts that should have scorched Earth's surface instead vanished into alternate realities, where they harmlessly illuminated empty void. The destroyer, Agony's End, tried to maintain course toward Earth, only to find itself flying in circles around a section of space that had been folded into a Mobius strip. The cruiser, Death's Promise, fired its planet-killer missiles, watching helplessly as they phased through Earth entirely and emerged from a dimensional rift behind their own ship. "What's happening to us?" screamed Commander Thexus as his console displayed readings that made no sense. According to sensors, their ship was simultaneously in 17 different locations, traveling in 6 directions at once while moving backward through time. Vorthak gripped his command chair as the bridge itself began to stretch and compress around him. Through the viewports, he could see Earth flickering between different versions of itself, sometimes blue and green, sometimes shrouded in clouds that showed glimpses of vast cities, sometimes appearing as pure energy held in the shape of a planet. His mighty warships, each one a testament to Draconian military superiority, were reduced to confused specks drifting through folded space. They were no longer attacking Earth. They were lost in a reality that humanity was casually reshaping around them, trapped like insects in amber made from the fundamental forces of the universe. And on Earth's surface, ordinary humans continued their daily lives, most of them completely unaware that their collective unconscious had just rewritten the laws of physics to protect their world from an alien invasion fleet. Admiral Vorthak braced himself for death as reality collapsed around his flagship. The bridge twisted and stretched like melting metal, his crew screaming as their instruments showed impossible readings. Space itself had become a funhouse mirror, reflecting distorted images of his scattered fleet drifting helplessly through folded dimensions. He closed his eyes, expecting the crushing void or the searing heat of stellar fire to end his existence. Instead, he felt soft grass beneath his feet and heard the gentle sound of children laughing. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in a peaceful meadow dotted with wildflowers. The sun was warm on his scales, and a light breeze carried the scent of blooming cherry trees. It was the most beautiful place he had ever seen, and it terrified him more than any battlefield. "You must be the Admiral," said a voice behind him. Vorthak spun around to see an ordinary human family having a picnic on a checkered blanket. The man who had spoken looked like he could be anyone's father, maybe 40 years old, wearing a simple blue shirt and jeans with laugh lines around his eyes and slightly graying hair. "I'm Taehyun," the man said, standing up and brushing crumbs from his hands. "This is my wife Soyoung, and our daughters Hyun and Chaewon." The woman smiled warmly, her kind face showing no fear despite being confronted by a 7-foot-tall reptilian alien. She was arranging flowers in a small vase, but the flowers seemed to arrange themselves, their petals opening to perfect symmetry at her touch. The twin girls, who looked about 8 years old, were playing with toys that made Vorthak's head spin. One child held what appeared to be a simple doll, but as she moved it through the air, small stars appeared and disappeared in its wake. The other was building with blocks that seemed to exist in more dimensions than should be possible, creating structures that folded in on themselves while remaining perfectly stable. "We're sorry about the confusion," So-young said gently, her voice carrying the warmth of a mother comforting a frightened child. "We try to appear primitive so we don't frighten younger species. It's better for everyone's development that way." Vorthak's mouth fell open as he looked around the meadow. In the distance, he could see his missing warships materializing like ghosts becoming solid. The massive Draconian vessels settled gently onto the grass without crushing a single flower, their hulls gleaming in the peaceful sunlight. Airlocks opened, and his missing crews began to emerge. But something was different about them. They moved, with an ease he'd never seen before, standing straighter, breathing deeper. Captain Nexor of the destroyer, Bone Crusher, stretched his arms above his head with a smile of pure joy, something no Draconian had done in living memory. "Your people are feeling much better now," Taehyun explained, noticing Vorthak's stare. "Our children notice that your species carries a lot of physical and emotional pain. They took the liberty of fixing what they could while they were studying your biology." "Studying?" Vorthak managed to croak. 8-year-old Hyun looked up from her impossible toys. "We wanted to understand how you work," she said in a voice that somehow spoke perfect Draconian despite her young age. "Your ships are really interesting, but we were more curious about why your people are so sad all the time." Her sister Chaewon nodded seriously. "Every one of your soldiers has nightmares about things they've done. We helped them remember happier times instead." Vorthak watched as his feared warriors, beings who had conquered worlds and crushed civilizations, played with human children like they were long-lost relatives. Commander Thexus was laughing as a group of kids showed him how to make flower crowns. Captain Xeris was sitting cross-legged on the grass, listening with fascination as a 10-year-old boy explained the basics of quantum mechanics using finger puppets. "You've been guiding us," Vorthak whispered as understanding began to dawn. "All this time, haven't you?" Taehyun nodded sadly. "For millennia. Every species goes through growing pains. The Draconian empires need to conquer your fear-based society. The way you use violence to solve problems, it's all part of natural development. Most civilizations grow out of it eventually. But some need a little help, So-Young added gently. She gestured toward the sky where Vorthak could see other ships beginning to appear, not Draconian vessels but craft from dozens of different species. The Zilithians were once conquerors like you. The Morphic Collective used to consume entire star systems. Now they're explorers and artists. You're gardeners, Vorthak said, the full scope of it hitting him like a physical blow. The entire galaxy. You've been carefully tending it like a garden. Not controlling, Taehyun corrected. Nurturing. Every species has to find its own path, but sometimes they need gentle nudges in the right direction. Young Chaewon ran up to Vorthak and took his clawed hand in her small one. To his amazement, her touch didn't hurt him. Instead, it filled him with a warmth he'd never experienced. Memories flooded his mind, not of conquest and battle, but of his childhood on the Draconian homeworld before the Empire's endless wars began. He remembered playing in tide pools, collecting shiny stones, dreaming of becoming an explorer instead of a destroyer. The Draconian Empire isn't our enemy, So-Young said softly. You're our children, and children sometimes need gentle correction when they misbehave. Around the meadow, other human families had appeared, each one hosting groups of Draconian soldiers. None of the humans looked like warriors or leaders. They were teachers, shopkeepers, students, retirees, ordinary people living extraordinary lives, completely comfortable in their role as guardians of galactic civilization. As the day wore on, Vorthak found himself sitting on the picnic blanket, sharing a simple meal with this impossible family. The food was unlike anything he'd ever tasted, not because it was exotic, but because it was prepared with a love he'd forgotten could exist. When it came time to leave, his fleet reassembled in space above Earth. But they were different ships now, crewed by different beings. The weapon systems had been quietly deactivated, not destroyed, but simply encouraged to become something else. The Death's Herald now carried gardens in its cargo bays. The Bone Crusher had been transformed into a mobile hospital. As they began the long journey home, Vorthak stood on his bridge and looked back at the blue world that had changed everything. On the surface, he knew, ordinary humans were returning to their daily lives. Baristas were making coffee, children were playing in parks, families were having dinner together. None of them seemed aware that they were the secret guardians of a galaxy, patiently nurturing younger species toward a better future. They were gentle giants hiding in plain sight, apex predators whose greatest weapon was compassion. The Draconian Empire would never be the same. Word would spread to other aggressive species, carried by beings who had experienced something impossible. Unconditional love from strangers who asked nothing in return, except that they try to be better than they were. And on Earth, humanity continued, its patient watch, tending their cosmic garden with the care of parents raising children they hoped would one day surpass them. The end.